I was the only new hire on the Robinson Woods logging crew, and for my first 2 weeks, everything seemed normal. Hard work, good pay, guys who knew what they were doing. But on my 15th day, I noticed something weird. My crew looked different. Not drastically different, but subtly wrong. Jake's eyes were the wrong color. I remembered them being blue, but now they were brown. Marcus had a scar on his left arm that I'd never seen before. And Tommy, who'd been at least 6 feet tall, was suddenly 3 inches shorter. When I mentioned it at lunch, they all looked at me like I was crazy. "You feeling okay?" Jake asked. "Maybe the heat's getting to you." But I knew something had changed, and I couldn't figure out what. That night, I came back to the work site after forgetting my thermos, and I saw something. The crew was still there, all 5 of them, but they weren't logging. They were standing in a circle around one of the massive oak trees, and they were synchronizing. That's the only word I can think of. They'd reach up and touch the tree at the same time, then step back in perfect unison, then forward again, like a ritual or a dance. And their shadows on the ground weren't matching their bodies. The shadows were doing something different, moving independently, stretching toward the tree like they were being pulled by something inside it. When I made a sound, just a small gasp, all 5 of them turned to look at me at exactly the same time, their necks snapping around in perfect synchronization, and they smiled with identical expressions. "You should go home," they said in unison, their voices overlapping. "The woods aren't safe after dark." I ran, got in my Honda and drove straight back to my apartment in Justice, hands shaking on the wheel the whole way down First Avenue. I didn't sleep, just sat there staring at the laminated protocol card Dale Pollack had given me on my first day, the one I'd barely glanced at, assuming it was standard safety bullshit. Now I read every word. The protocols weren't about safety, they were about survival. And the more I read them, the more I understood that whatever was happening in Robinson Woods wasn't new. The county knew. They'd known for years, ever since the chemical dumping scandal in the 80s, when some contractor had buried God knows what in the soil near the Des Plaines River. The protocols weren't there to protect the trees. They were there to protect us from what lived in our shadows. I should have quit right then. Should have found another job, any other job. But I needed the money. And I kept thinking about those synchronized smiles, those wrong-colored eyes. I kept thinking, if I don't go back, who's going to warn the next hire? So the next morning, I went back to Robinson Woods, and I brought that protocol card with me. Dale was waiting for me in the parking lot off First Avenue when I arrived at 6:30. He stood beside his truck, a thermos of coffee steaming in the October cold, and he watched me pull in with an expression I couldn't read. "Came back to the site last night," he said. Not a question. I killed the engine. My hands were still sore from gripping the steering wheel too tight during the drive home. I forgot my thermos. That why you're here this morning? Because you forgot a thermos? I got out of the car. The forest smelled different than it had yesterday. Sharper, like ozone before a storm. I need this job. Dale studied me for a long moment, then pulled out a cigarette and lit it. "You read the protocols?" "Yes." "All of them?" "Yes." He took a drag, exhaled slowly. "Then you know why we gave you 2 weeks before we started the real work. We needed to see if you'd stick around." He reached into his truck bed and pulled out a yellow equipment bag. "You passed. Now comes the hard part." The crew was already at the logging site when we arrived, unloading chainsaws and fuel from the back of Tommy Kowalczyk's pickup. Jake Sullivan gave me a nod. His eyes were blue again, the same shade I remembered from my first day. Marcus Chen waved from where he stood marking trees with orange spray paint and Tommy looked exactly 6 feet tall, maybe an inch over. They looked normal. They looked like themselves. "Good to see you," Jake said, handing me a pair of work gloves. "Heard you had a rough night." "Dale told you?" "Didn't have to. Everyone has a rough night eventually." He gestured toward the tree line where the marked ashes stood waiting. "You understand the protocols now?" I pulled out the laminated card. 7 rules, written in faded blue ink. Protocol 1. Never work alone. Maintain visual contact with at least one crew member at all times. Protocol 2. If your shadow detaches from your feet, stop moving immediately and call for Dale. Protocol 3. Work only in designated grid zones marked with orange flags. Do not cross into unmarked territory. Protocol 4. If you see someone who looks like a crew member but casts no shadow, do not acknowledge them. Do not answer if they speak. Protocol 5. All equipment must return with the crew at day's end. Count tools before leaving. Count them again. Protocol 6. Never touch the old oak trees marked with yellow tape. They are not part of the logging operation. Protocol 7. If the Des Plaines River begins flowing backward, evacuate immediately. Do not stop to collect equipment. "They sound crazy," I said. Marcus joined us, wiping spray paint from his hands onto his jeans. "They sound crazy until you need them." He was maybe 30, with the kind of calm that comes from seeing things you can't explain. "Dale tell you about the contamination? Mentioned something about chemical dumping in the 80s. Sherwin-Williams had a disposal site near here," Marcus said. "Buried barrels of industrial solvents and paint additives in the ground before the EPA started giving a shit. They hit groundwater, leached into the soil around the river. County tried to clean it up in '92, but by then, the damage was done." Jake picked up a chainsaw, checked the fuel. "The chemicals did something to the trees. Changed how they interact with light, with shadow. We don't understand it. Hell, the scientists don't understand it. But we know what happens if you ignore the protocols." "What happens?" The 3 of them exchanged glances. Tommy walked over, a coil of rope over his shoulder. He was younger than the others, maybe 25, with the build of someone who'd grown up doing physical work. "Your shadow detaches," he said quietly. "It separates from you and starts living its own life. And if it's separated long enough, it goes looking for someone else to attach to someone who won't notice right away." I thought about Jake's wrong-colored eyes, Marcus's phantom scar, Tommy's shifting height. "You weren't yourselves last night," I said, "when I came back for the thermos." "No," Jake admitted. "We weren't. Our shadows were running the show. Happens every few weeks. They get strong enough to take control for a few hours, usually after sunset. That's why Protocol 2 exists. You catch the detachment early. Dale can help you fix it. You let it go too long." He didn't finish the sentence. Dale appeared from the trail, carrying a metal detector and what looked like a modified EMF meter. "Grid 7 today," he announced. "Tyler, you're with me. Rest of you know the drill." I followed him into the woods, past the hiking trail markers and the signs warning visitors to stay out. The protocols card felt heavy in my pocket. Behind us, the crew started their chainsaws. The sound echoed through Robinson Woods, and for just a moment, I thought I heard the echo answer back. Grid 7 sat a quarter-mile past the last public trail marker, in a section of Robinson Woods where the ash trees grew dense enough to block out most of the morning sun. Dale moved through the undergrowth with the metal detector sweeping side to side, the device clicking softly as we walked. "We mapped the contamination before we cut," he explained. "The barrels weren't buried in one spot. They were scattered across maybe 40 acres. Some of them ruptured decades ago. the soil's still saturated in places. I watched my shadow stretch across the leaf litter. It looked normal, attached to my feet the way shadows should be. How do you know when it's detaching? You feel it, like something tugging at your heels, gentle at first, gets stronger the longer you ignore it. Dale stopped walking, crouched down near a cluster of exposed roots. The metal detector was going wild. Here, mark this spot. I pulled out the orange spray paint and marked an X on the nearest tree trunk. How many barrels are still out here? County records say 47 were disposed of between 82 and 86. We found 31. He stood up, wiped dirt from his hands. The rest are deeper, or they've corroded completely and mixed with groundwater. Either way, the damage spreads. We continued mapping for 2 hours. Dale worked with the focus of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, and I followed his lead, spraying marks on trees and logging coordinates in a weather-beaten notebook he kept in his vest pocket. The forest was quiet except for the distant sound of chainsaws and the occasional bird call. Then I felt it. A tug. Light. Barely noticeable. Like someone had hooked a finger through my belt loop and pulled gently downward. I stopped walking. Dale. He looked back at me, saw my expression, and immediately set down the metal detector. Don't move. Look at your feet. I looked down. My shadow was still there, still connected, but it was shifting. The edges rippled like water disturbed by wind, and as I watched, the shadow's hand lifted away from the ground. Just an inch, just for a second, before settling back down. Protocol 2, Dale said calmly. He approached slowly, pulling something from his equipment bag. It looked like a road flare, but the casing was painted white instead of red. This is going to feel strange. Don't fight it. He struck the flare. Instead of red flame, it produced a harsh white light that hurt to look at directly. Bright enough to cast sharp shadows even in the filtered sunlight, Dale held it above my head, moving it in a slow circle. The tugging sensation intensified. My shadow writhed across the ground, darkening and then lightening, its edges pulling away and snapping back like rubber bands. I felt dizzy, like part of me was being stretched in 2 directions at once. Stay still, Dale said. It's trying to anchor itself somewhere else. We need to remind it where it belongs. The white light completed its circle. My shadow shuddered once, violently, and then settled flat against the ground. The tugging stopped. Dale extinguished the flare. You're good. It hadn't separated yet. You caught it early. I bent over, hands on my knees, breathing hard. What the hell was that? Your shadow getting ideas. He packed the flare back in his bag. The contamination does something to the bond between a body and its shadow, weakens it. You spend enough time in these woods, especially near the buried barrels, and the connection starts to fray. That's when they detach. And then what? They just wander around. They look for new hosts, usually other people working in the woods, hikers, maintenance crews, anyone who doesn't know to watch for them. Dale resumed walking, and I followed, checking my shadow every few steps. Once a shadow attaches to someone new, it starts influencing them. Small things at first. Wrong eye color, different height, scars that weren't there before the host doesn't usually notice. But over time, the shadow takes over completely, becomes the dominant personality. I thought about the crew last night, standing in that circle around the oak tree. That's what I saw. Jake and the others weren't themselves. They were their shadows, Dale corrected. The shadows had enough control to puppeteer them for a few hours. It passes by morning usually, but it's getting worse, happening more frequently. We reached a section where yellow tape marked several massive oak trees, their trunks easily 6 feet across. Protocol 6. I steered clear of them automatically. "Why can't we touch those?" I asked. Dale glanced at the oaks, his expression darkening. "Because those are where the shadows go when they're not attached to anyone. The contamination concentrated around these specific trees. Something about the root systems, how deep they go. The shadows gather there. Dozens of them, maybe more. You touch one of those trunks, you're putting your hand directly into a nest." The hair on my arm stood up. I could see shadows pooling around the base of the nearest oak, dark patches that didn't quite match the angle of the sun. They moved slightly, independent of any breeze. "Tyler," Dale's voice was sharp, "step back, slowly." I'd gotten too close without realizing it. One of the pooled shadows had stretched toward me, a tendril of darkness reaching across the leaf litter like a finger. I took 3 steps backward. The shadow retreated, folding back into the mass around the oak's roots. "They're aggressive near the trees," Dale said. "Territorial. That's why we mark them, so the crew knows to keep their distance." He checked his watch. "We're done mapping for today. Let's head back." We walked in silence for a while. My shadow stayed put, behaving itself. But I couldn't stop checking. Every few seconds, glancing down to make sure it was still attached properly. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. 7 years. Started right after my brother." He trailed off, then shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Point is, I know how to handle it. Taught the crew everything they need to survive." "Your brother worked here?" Dale didn't answer immediately. We emerged from the tree line into Grid 4, where Jake and Tommy were hauling cut logs onto Tommy's truck. Both of them looked up as we approached, and I found myself checking their shadows first, making sure they were properly attached. "My brother didn't follow the protocols," Dale finally said. "Thought he knew better. Thought the rules were just liability theater." He met my eyes. His shadow detached completely. Took him 3 days to notice. By then, it had already found someone else. "Who?" Dale pulled out his cigarettes, lit one with shaking hands. "Me. For about 6 months, I wasn't myself. My brother's shadow was driving, and I was just along for the ride. Jake and Marcus helped me get it out, but..." He exhaled smoke. "I still remember things it made me do. Things I didn't want to do, but couldn't stop." Jake called out, asking if we'd finished the contamination sweep. Dale waved in acknowledgement and started walking toward the trucks. I stood there for a moment, watching my shadow on the ground. It looked harmless. It looked like it had always looked. But now I knew better. If you like the stories, please hype the videos from a button like this just above the comment section. It helps the videos to get more reach and perform well. It would take just a few seconds and cost nothing, but would help the channel grow even faster. Thank you. The lunch break happened at noon, same as always. We gathered near Tommy's truck, eating sandwiches and drinking water from coolers packed with ice. The October sun felt good after the morning's work, and for a few minutes, things felt almost ordinary. Marcus had brought pierogi from his aunt's place in Bridgeport, and he passed them around wrapped in foil. Jake complained about the Cubs' pitching rotation. Tommy scrolled through his phone, showing us pictures of his daughter's 4th birthday party. I ate my sandwich and tried not to stare at everyone's shadows. "You'll drive yourself crazy doing that," Marcus said quietly. He'd noticed me looking, checking every 5 seconds. How do you not check? You get used to it. We're in the difference between normal shadow behavior and when something's actually wrong. He bit into a pierogi. Besides, we're in direct sunlight right now. Shadows are strongest here, most stable. It's when we're working under tree cover that you need to worry." Jake stretched, joints popping. "Tyler handled the detachment pretty well this morning. Better than I did my first time." "What happened your first time?" "Panicked. Tried to run from my own shadow." He laughed, but it was hollow. "Made it worse. The more you move when it's pulling away, the easier it is for the connection to break completely. Dale had to tackle me, hold me down while he used the flare." Tommy looked up from his phone. "Mine happened during winter. Remember that, Dale? February, 3 years ago?" Dale nodded, lighting a cigarette. "You were working near Grid 9. Shadow detached in less than a minute." "I didn't feel the tugging," Tommy explained. "Just looked down and my shadow was gone. Completely gone. Like I was a vampire or something." He shuddered at the memory. "Scariest 30 seconds of my life before Dale got the flare lit." "Where did it go?" I asked. "Into the trees. Same place they all go." Marcus pointed toward the yellow-taped oaks, barely visible through the forest. "That's why Protocol 6 exists. Those trees are collection points. Any shadow that detaches ends up there eventually." I thought about the darkness pooling around those oak roots, the tendril that had reached for me. How many shadows are in there? "No way to know for sure," Dale said. "At least a few dozen. Maybe more. Some of them have been there since the 80s, when the contamination first started affecting people. Utility workers, county employees, hikers who wandered too close." He took a drag from his cigarette. "They wait. Patient as anything. And when someone gets close enough, they try to attach." The walkie-talkie on Dale's belt crackled. A voice came through, distorted by stomach. "Dale, you there?" Dale frowned. He picked up the radio. "Who is this?" "It's Jake. I'm over in Grid 8. Need you to come take a look at something." We all turned to look at Jake, who was sitting right there next to us, sandwich halfway to his mouth. "I'm not in Grid 8, Jake said slowly. He reached for his own walkie-talkie, clicked the transmit button. "Identify yourself." Silence. Then, "What are you talking about?" "It's me. It's Jake. I found something weird near the old dumping site." Real Jake's face went pale. "Protocol 4, he whispered. Dale grabbed the radio. "Do not respond to that transmission. Everyone stay where you are." "What's going on?" the voice on the radio asked. It sounded exactly like Jake. Same inflection, same slight south side accent. "Dale? Marcus? Someone answer me." Tommy stood up, scanning the tree line. "Where is it?" "Grid 8 is north," Marcus said. "Past the orange flags, that's unmarked territory." Protocol 3, do not cross into unmarked territory. Protocol 4, if you see someone who looks like a crew member but casts no shadow, do not acknowledge them. Do not answer if they speak. "It's a copy," Dale said quietly. "A shadow that's taken on Jake's appearance. Probably happened this morning when Jake's shadow started acting up near the contaminated site in Grid 5. "My shadow's fine," Jake insisted, looking down at it. It lay flat and normal on the ground, attached at his feet. "It's right here." "Now it is. But this morning, for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, it separated. That's all it takes." Dale kept his eyes on the forest. "The shadow makes a copy of you, stores the information. Then it can manifest that appearance later, trying to lure people close." The radio crackled again. "Why aren't you answering? I need help over here. The ground's doing something strange and The voice cut off, replaced by static. "Turn it off," Dale ordered. Marcus switched off his radio. Tommy did the same. I didn't have one, but I watched as Dale powered down his own walkie-talkie and clipped it back to his belt. "We don't respond," he said. "We don't go looking. Shadow copies can't maintain the form for long without someone to anchor to. It'll dissolve in an hour or two." "But what if someone else hears it?" I asked. "What if a county worker or someone from the parks department shows up and tries to help?" Dale's expression darkened. "Then we hope they've read the protocols." We finished lunch in tense silence. I kept glancing toward Grid 8, half expecting to see Jake walking out of the trees, a second Jake, identical to the one sitting next to me. But the forest stayed empty. At 1 o'clock, we resumed work. Dale split us into pairs. Protocol 1 required visual contact with at least one crew member at all times. I was paired with Marcus, working on clearing underbrush near Grid 6, while Jake and Tommy handled the chainsaw work 40 feet away. Marcus moved efficiently, gathering branches and loading them into the truck. I tried to match his pace, but I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the tree line. "You're doing it again," Marcus said. "Sorry." "Don't apologize. Just breathe." He tossed a branch onto the pile. "The fear doesn't go away. You just learn to work with it. Understand that the protocols keep you safe as long as you follow them exactly." I grabbed another branch, dragged it toward the truck. "Dale said his brother didn't follow them." Marcus paused. "Dale's brother thought he was smarter than the rules, thought he could outsmart his own shadow." He wiped sweat from his forehead. 5 years ago, he was working alone in Grid 12, breaking Protocol 1. His shadow detached, and instead of calling for help, he tried to chase it down, crossed into unmarked territory, broke Protocol 3. By the time Dale found him, his shadow had already transferred to someone else. To Dale. Yeah, and Dale's original shadow ended up in those oak trees. Marcus pointed toward the yellow tape. "That's the thing people don't understand. When a shadow takes over, it's not possession like in the movies. It's replacement. Your consciousness gets pushed aside, stored somewhere in the background, while the shadow runs your body like a puppet. You can see what it's doing. You can feel yourself doing things you don't want to do. But you can't stop it." A branch cracked behind us. We both spun around. Nothing. Just wind moving through the trees. Marcus exhaled. "Let's keep moving. We want to finish this section before 3. We worked for another hour, maintaining line-of-sight contact the whole time. Jake and Tommy's chainsaw echoed through the woods, a constant mechanical rhythm that somehow felt reassuring. As long as I could hear it, I knew they were still there, still themselves. At 2:30, I felt the tugging again. It was stronger this time. Not gentle like before, but insistent, like something had grabbed my ankles and was pulling hard. I stumbled, caught myself against a tree trunk. "Marcus." He looked over, saw me gripping the tree, and immediately started pulling the white flare from his vest. "Don't move! Dale!" he shouted toward the other work site. "We need another flare over here." My shadow was pewing away from my feet like wallpaper curling off a damp wall. I could see the separation happening, a visible gap opening between the sole of my boot and the darkness that should have been directly beneath it. The shadow twisted, stretching toward the unmarked section of forest, toward Grid 8, where the Jake copy had called from. Dale came running, flare already lit. The white light hit my shadow and it recoiled, snapping back toward me like elastic. But it didn't reattach. It hovered there, maybe 6 inches above the ground, trembling. "It's fighting," Dale said through gritted teeth. "It wants to go to the trees." "Don't let it," I managed to say. My legs felt weak, hollow, like something essential had been drained from them. Dale circled the flare again, the white light casting stark shadows across the forest floor. My shadow shuddered, went limp, and finally settled back against the ground where it belonged. The tugging stopped. I collapsed to my knees, gasping. Dale sent me home early. I didn't argue. My apartment in Justice felt too quiet after the constant noise of the forest. I stood in the kitchen, drinking water straight from the tap, and watched my shadow on the linoleum floor. It looked stable, behaving the way shadows were supposed to. But I remembered how it had felt when it tried to pull away, like part of my soul was being torn loose. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pooled shadows around the oak trees, writhing and reaching. I kept the lights on in my bedroom, all 3 lamps blazing, creating multiple shadows that overlapped on the walls. Somehow that felt safer than having just one. At 4 a.m, I gave up and drove to the 24-hour Dunkin' on 79th Street. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh and steady, casting sharp shadows that didn't move. The counter worker, a tired-looking woman named Lorena, according to her name tag, barely glanced at me as she poured coffee. "Rough night?" she asked. "You could say that." "Working construction?" "Logging. Robinson Woods." Her hand paused mid-pour. Coffee sloshed over the rim of the cup. She set the pot down carefully, wiped up the spill, and pushed the cup toward me without making eye contact. "You should quit that job," she said quietly. "You know about it?" "My cousin worked there 2 years ago." She glanced toward the window, where dawn was just starting to lighten the sky. "He's different now. Doesn't talk much. Barely leaves his apartment. Sometimes I'll visit him and he'll just be sitting in the dark, staring at the wall. When I ask what's wrong, he says his shadow keeps telling him to go back to the woods." I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. "Did he follow the protocols?" "I don't know what that means." "The safety rules, the procedures for working in the contaminated areas." Lorena shook her head. "Nobody told him about any rules. They just hired him, sent him out with a chainsaw, and expected him to figure it out. He lasted 3 weeks before something happened. He won't tell me what, but after that..." She trailed off. "Just quit. It's not worth whatever they're paying you." I drove back to my apartment as the sun came up, Lorena's words echoing in my head. The protocols existed because people like her cousin hadn't known to follow them. How many workers have the county sent into those woods over the years? How many have their shadows detach without anyone there to help them reattach? My phone rang at 6:30. Dale's number. "Tyler, we've got a problem. Can you come in?" "What kind of problem?" "The kind that needs everyone on site. I'll explain when you get here." The crew was gathered in the parking lot when I arrived, standing near Tommy's truck in a tight cluster. They all looked exhausted, like they'd been up all night. Jake's eyes were bloodshot. Marcus kept checking his phone, jaw clenched. Tommy leaned against his truck's tailgate, smoking with shaking hands. Dale held up a clear plastic bag. Inside was a Forest Preserve's identification badge. "County worker," he said. "Rachel Dombrowski. She was supposed to be checking trail conditions near the Des Plaines River yesterday afternoon. Never checked back in. Her supervisor called me an hour ago asking if we'd seen her." "Grid 8, Marcus said grimly. "She must have heard the radio transmission, the shadow copy calling for help." Jake swore under his breath. "We need to find her." "We don't go into unmarked territory," Dale said. "Protocol 3 exists for a reason." "She doesn't know the protocols. She's probably wandering around looking for whoever called her on the radio." Tommy crushed his cigarette under his boot. "We can't just leave her in there." Dale was quiet for a long moment. "If we go in, We go in prepared. Full equipment, stay in pairs, and we don't split up for any reason. Understood? We gathered gear from the trailer. White flares, flashlights, rope, first aid kit. Dale handed me a can of orange spray paint. "If we find her," he said, "you mark the path back. Every 20 feet, mark a tree. We might need to evacuate quickly, and in unmarked territory, it's easy to get turned around." The walk to Grid 8 took 15 minutes. We crossed the orange flow boundary at 7:40, and the temperature dropped immediately. Not much, maybe 5 degrees, but enough to notice the air felt heavier here, pressing against my skin. "Stay together," Dale reminded us. "Eyes on each other at all times." The contamination was worse in this section. I could see it in the trees, bark peeling away in strange patterns, leaves turning colors that didn't match the season. Some of the ash trees had split open, their heartwood exposed and blackened like they'd been burned from the inside. Marcus walked point, checking his GPS every few minutes. Jake and Tommy flanked us, watching the tree line. I marked trees as we went, bright orange X's that stood out against the gray-brown bark. We found Rachel's radio first. It lay on the ground near a massive oak tree, its antenna snapped off, display screen cracked. No sign of Rachel herself. "She was here," Marcus said, crouching beside the radio. "Recently. The grass is still compressed where she was standing." Dale scanned the area. There were tracks in the soft earth, boot prints, heading deeper into the unmarked section. But something was wrong with them. The prints were too evenly spaced, like someone walking with perfect measured steps. No natural variation in stride length. "Those aren't her tracks," Dale said quietly. "How do you know?" "Because those are walking away from her radio, not toward it." He pointed at a second set of prints, lighter and more erratic, leading in the opposite direction. "Those are hers. She's running." We followed Rachel's tracks through increasingly dense undergrowth. I marked trees compulsively now, every 15 feet instead of 20, making sure we could find our way back. The shadows here moved wrong, shifting against the angle of sunlight, pooling in places they shouldn't. Then we heard her screaming. It came from ahead, maybe 100 yards into the trees. Not words, just raw panic, the sound of someone whose mind had broken under fear. We ran. Rachel was backed against a birch tree, staring at something we couldn't see. She was maybe 40, wearing a county uniform vest and hiking boots, and her eyes were wide enough to show white all around. When she saw us, she pointed. "They're everywhere," she gasped. "They're all over the ground, and they keep trying to touch me." I looked where she was pointing. Shadows. Dozens of them, maybe more, spreading across the forest floor like spilled oil. They moved independently, disconnected from any source, reaching toward Rachel with fingers that weren't quite fingers. Some of them had taken on vague human shapes, heads, shoulders, limbs, but distorted, stretched too long. "Don't move," Dale told Rachel. He pulled out 3 white flares, handed one to Jake and one to Marcus. "On 3, light them. We're making a perimeter." They struck the flares simultaneously. White light flooded the area, harsh and clean, and the shadows recoiled like living things, pulling back from Rachel and retreating toward the oak trees deeper in the forest. But they didn't disappear. They hovered at the edge of the light, waiting. "Get her up," Dale ordered. "We're leaving. Now." Jake and Tommy helped Rachel to her feet. She was shaking badly, barely able to walk. Marcus took point again, following my orange marks back toward the boundary. We made it maybe 50 feet before I realized something was wrong. My shadow was gone. I looked down at my feet. Nothing. The white flare light should have cast a shadow, but beneath my boots was just bare earth, no darkness at all. "Dale," I said. My voice sounded distant, hollow. "Protocol 2. He turned, saw my shadowless feet, and his face went pale. "Where did it go?" Marcus asked. Dale's eyes swept the forest floor, searching. Then he looked up at the trees, and I saw fear break across his expression. "There," he whispered. My shadow was above us, clinging to the underside of a massive oak branch like a bat. It hung there, person-shaped but flat, and as we watched, it peeled away from the bark and began descending toward the ground, coming for someone new to attach to. Coming for Rachel, who stood right beneath it, who had no idea what was about to happen. "Rachel, move!" Dale shouted, but Rachel was frozen, staring at the mass of shadows still retreating from the flare light, completely unaware of what was descending from above. My shadow dropped from the branch silently, falling like a sheet of paper, and landed across her shoulders. She gasped, stumbled. Her own shadow, which had been cast by the flare light, flickered and vanished. "No, no, no!" Dale was already running toward her, pulling another flare from his belt. "Marcus, hold her still!" Marcus grabbed Rachel by the arms. She struggled, confused and terrified, as Dale struck the flare and held it directly over her head. The white light blazed down, and I saw my shadow writhing across her back, like it was trying to burrow into her clothes. "It's not working," Jake said. "It's already attached." Dale circled the flare again, more slowly this time, creating a continuous ring of light above Rachel's head. My shadow began to smoke, not real smoke, but something that looked like steam rising off hot pavement. It peeled away from Rachel's shoulders 1 inch at a time, resisting, fighting to stay connected. I felt nothing. No tugging. No connection to what was happening. It was like watching a stranger's shadow get removed from someone else's body. The detachment was complete. "Tyler, get over here," Dale commanded. I walked closer, my boots crunching on dead leaves. Without a shadow, I felt lighter somehow, like I weighed less than I should. It wasn't a good feeling. "When I pull it off her, you need to reattach it immediately," Dale said. "Stand right next to her, close enough that your shadow and hers would overlap." "I don't know how to do that." "You don't have to know. Your body will remember. Just stand close and don't move." Dale made one more circle with the flare. My shadow came loose all at once, falling away from Rachel like a blanket being pulled off a bed. It hit the ground and immediately started sliding toward the oak trees, moving fast across the leaf litter. I stepped into its path. The shadow hit my feet and stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt a rush of sensation, like blood flow returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. The shadow flowed up my legs, across my torso, and settled back into its proper position beneath me. The connection snapped back into place. I gasped, nearly fell, caught myself against a tree trunk. Everything felt too intense, colors too bright, sounds too loud. Marcus steadied me while Dale checked Rachel. "She's clear," he said. "Shadow's gone, but she needs medical attention." Rachel's eyes had rolled back. She was breathing, but barely, and her skin had gone gray. Jake pulled out his phone, swore when he saw no signal, and started back toward the marked boundary. "I'll call from the parking lot," he said. "Get her out of here." Tommy and Marcus supported Rachel between them, following Jake's path. Dale stayed back with me, watching the shadows that still lurked at the edge of the flare light. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Wrong. Like I'm not quite in my own body. That'll pass. The reattachment takes a few hours to fully set." He extinguished the flare, and we started walking. "You got lucky. Another minute, and your shadow would have bonded to her completely. We'd have had to make a choice. What choice? Dale didn't answer immediately. We followed my orange marks back through the unmarked territory, moving quickly. Behind us, I heard the shadows moving through the undergrowth, following at a distance. The shadows can only attach to one person at a time. Dale finally said, "If your shadow had bonded to Rachel, we'd have had two options. Let it stay attached to her, which means you'd be shadowless until you died or found another shadow to take. Or force it off her and back to you, which might kill her in the process." I thought about Rachel's gray skin, her labored breathing. That's what happened to your brother, isn't it? His shadow bonded to you, and you had to force it off. Not exactly. My brother's shadow chose to leave him, transferred to me willingly because I was family, genetically similar. The bond was easier. Dale checked over his shoulder. The shadows were keeping pace with us, dark shapes moving between the trees. But getting it out of me took 6 months. 6 months of my brother's shadow controlling my body, while Jake and Marcus worked to separate us. By the time they succeeded, my original shadow was gone, absorbed into the trees. So the shadow you have now belongs to someone else. Someone who died in these woods back in '97. A botanist studying the effects of chemical contamination on root systems. He pulled out his cigarettes, lit one. I don't know his name. Don't know what he looked like. But his shadow functions well enough. Keeps me alive. Keeps me grounded. That's all that matters. We reached the orange flag boundary at 8:40. The temperature rose as we crossed back into marked territory, and the shadows that had been following us stopped at the invisible line they gathered there just beyond the flags, watching us leave. An ambulance was waiting in the parking lot when we emerged from the forest. The paramedics loaded Rachel onto a stretcher while a county supervisor, a nervous man named Peterson, who kept adjusting his glasses, asked Dale what happened. "She wandered into an unmarked contamination zone," Dale said. "Probably inhaled something toxic. We found her disoriented, having trouble breathing." It wasn't exactly a lie, just an explanation Peterson could understand. The ambulance pulled away, lights flashing. Jake, Tommy, and Marcus stood near the trucks, none of them looking at each other. The morning's work had taken something out of all of us. "We're done for the day," Dale announced. "Everyone goes home, rests, comes back tomorrow if you're able." "What about Grid 8? Tommy asked. "We left equipment in there." "Protocol 5. Tools can be replaced. We'll retrieve them tomorrow in daylight, with a full crew." I drove back to Justice in a daze. My shadow looked normal in the rearview mirror, stretched across the back seat by the afternoon sun. But I kept remembering how it felt to watch it detach completely, to see it try to claim someone else's body as its own. That night, I dreamed about the oak trees. I stood in their shadow, singular, because all their individual shadows had merged into one massive pool of darkness, and watched shapes move beneath the surface, faces pressed up from below, mouths opening in silent screams. Some of them looked familiar. People I'd seen around Justice, around Cook County. People who'd gone missing over the years, their cases unsolved. Not missing, taken, replaced by their own shadows. I woke up at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat. My apartment felt wrong, like the walls were too close together. I checked my shadow under every light source I could find. Kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, hallway. It was there, attached, behaving properly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed during the reattachment. That the shadow beneath me wasn't quite the same one I'd had before. At 5, I gave up on sleep and drove back to Robinson Woods. I don't know what I was looking for. Answers, maybe, or just confirmation that what I had experienced was real. The parking lot was empty, the gates still locked. I parked on First Avenue and walked in. Dawn was breaking when I reached the yellow-taped oak trees. The shadows around their roots were thinner in daylight, less aggressive, but still present. I stood at the edge of Protocol 6's boundary and stared at them. One of the shadows moved, not randomly, but deliberately, forming the shape I recognized. It was human-sized, Tyler-sized, and as I watched, it raised one arm in a wave. My own shadow, the one attached to my feet, didn't move. But the shadow in the oak tree's pool moved again, beckoning me closer. I took a step back, then another. The tree shadow stayed where it was, arms still raised, and I realized what I was looking at. My original shadow, the one that had detached and tried to bond with Rachel. We'd reattached a shadow to me, but it wasn't mine. Mine was still in there, trapped in the oak tree's root system with all the others, and it wanted out. I heard footsteps behind me, turned to find Dale approaching, coffee thermos in hand. He looked at the oak trees, then at me, and seemed to understand immediately. "Saw your car on First Avenue," he said. "Figured you'd be here." "That's mine," I said, pointing at the tree shadow. "That's my original shadow." Dale nodded slowly. "Happens sometimes. The reattachment grabs whatever shadow is closest. Usually it's your own, but if it's already been absorbed by the trees." He took a sip of coffee. "The shadow you have now works just fine. Bombs just as well, keeps you alive, casts properly. There's no functional difference. Except somewhere in those trees is a piece of me that doesn't belong there. Except that, yeah." The tree shadow lowered its arm, settled back into the pool of darkness. I watched it disappear among the others, indistinguishable from the dozens of trapped shadows around it. "We need to fix this," I said. "All of it. Not just treat the symptoms with protocols and white flares. Actually fix what's happening here." Dale was quiet for a long moment. Then he handed me his thermos. "Come on," he said. "There's something I need to show you. Something the county's been hiding for 30 years." We walked deeper into the woods, past Grid 7 and Grid 8, into sections I've never seen marked on any map. The unmarked territory extended farther than I'd thought. We walked for 20 minutes, deeper into sections of Robinson Woods, where the trees grew dense enough to block out most of the morning light. Dale navigated from memory, taking turns at specific landmarks. A lightning-struck elm, a boulder with surveyor's marks, a cluster of birch trees growing in a perfect circle. "County bought this land in '79, Dale explained as we walked. "Annexed it to the forest preserve specifically because of what Sherwin-Williams had been doing here. By the time the EPA got involved, the company had already buried 47 barrels across the entire site. You said you found 31. We found 31 in the public sections, the sections where people actually work." He ducked under a low branch. "The rest are here, in what the county calls the exclusion zone." We emerged into a clearing I hadn't known existed. At its center sat a concrete structure, half buried in earth and overgrown with vines. It looked like a bunker from World War II, except the door was modern, steel with a keypad lock. A sign bolted to the concrete read, "Cook County Department of Environment and Sustainability. Authorized personnel only." Dale punched in a code. The lock clicked open. Inside was a monitoring station. Banks of equipment lined the walls, computers, sensors, what looked like spectrographic analysis gear. Everything was running, lights blinking, screens displaying graphs and data streams. In the center of the room stood a large table covered with maps of Robinson Woods. Red dots marked contamination sites. Yellow circles indicated the oak trees. Blue triangles showed where shadows had been documented detaching from people. "The county's been monitoring this since '92, Dale said. After the first cleanup failed, they realized the contamination had created something they couldn't explain. So they did what bureaucracies do best. They documented it, classified it, and pretended it wasn't their problem. I studied the maps. The red dots clustered heavily in the unmarked territories, but they spread throughout the entire preserve. These chemicals, they're what causes the shadow detachment. Not directly. The contamination altered how light interacts with organic matter in specific zones, changed the properties of shadow formation at a quantum level." Dale pulled up a file on one of the computers. "There was a physicist from University of Chicago who studied it in '95, Dr. Sarah Chen. She theorized that the industrial solvents contained trace elements that, when they leached into soil around tree root systems, created what she called photonic anomaly zones, places where shadows could partially decouple from their sources. That's what the oak trees are, anomaly zones." "Exactly. The oaks have root systems that go down 30 feet or more. They absorbed the highest concentrations of contamination, and now they act as anchors. Shadows that detach get pulled toward them like iron to magnets." He closed the file. Dr. Chen wanted to clean it up properly, excavate the entire site, remove every contaminated tree, treat the soil. The county said it would cost $40 million. They had her research classified instead. I felt sick. How many people have lost their shadows here? Official count is 63, but that's just the ones the county knows about. Hikers, workers, anyone who spent enough time near the contamination zones. Dale opened another file. Photos filled the screen, before and after shots of people's faces. The differences were subtle, but unmistakable. Wrong eye colors, different facial structures, scars appearing or disappearing. These are documented cases, people whose shadows detached and attached to someone else before they could be recovered. One photo showed a young woman, maybe 25. In the before picture, she was smiling, surrounded by friends at what looked like a backyard party. In the after picture, taken 6 months later, she sat alone in what appeared to be a hospital room. Her face had the same features, but something fundamental had changed. The way she held herself, the emptiness in her eyes. "What happened to her?" Her shadow detached during a camping trip in Robinson Woods, bonded to her sister. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the original shadow had been absorbed into the trees. The woman in that second photo is living with a replacement shadow that belonged to a maintenance worker who died here in '89. Dale closed the file. She doesn't remember her childhood correctly. Can't recognize the taste of her favorite foods. Lost her ability to play piano, even though she'd been taking lessons for 15 years. The shadow you wear shapes who you are. Lose your original, and you lose pieces of yourself. I thought about my own shadow, the replacement one currently attached to my feet. What parts of me had I already lost? What memories would start to feel wrong? "There has to be a way to reverse it," I said, "to get the original shadows out of the trees." Dr. Chen thought so. She designed a prototype system before the county shut her down. Dale walked to a cabinet in the corner, unlocked it, and pulled out a rolled blueprint. He spread it across the map table. She called it a photonic restoration grid, essentially a massive array of UV lights that would flood the contamination zones with specific wavelengths. The theory was that intense controlled light exposure could force detached shadows to reattach to their original sources. The blueprint showed a network of lights arranged in a grid pattern, each one positioned around the major oak trees. Notes in the margins detailed the required wavelengths, intensity levels, and exposure durations. In the corner, Dr. Chen had written, "Successful lab tests with shadow samples, ready for field implementation." Why didn't they build it? Because to make it work, they'd have to admit what happened here. Admit the contamination created something supernatural. Admit they'd been covering it up for years. Dale rolled the blueprint back up. Easier to just keep monitoring, keep following protocols, let the shadows stay trapped. I stared at the blueprint in Dale's hands. We could build it ourselves. Tyler, this system would require industrial equipment, specialized UV lamps, power generators. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in materials. The county has that money. They've been funding this monitoring station for 30 years. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera app. What if we made them build it? What if we exposed what they've been hiding? Dale went very still. That's a dangerous game. More dangerous than letting people keep losing their shadows. More dangerous than what happened to your brother, to that woman in the photo, to Rachel yesterday. I started photographing the maps, the equipment, the files on the computer screen. They're covering this up because they don't want the liability. But if it goes public, if people know the county's been letting this happen, they'll have to act. They'll also shut down the entire forest preserve, shut down our operation, put up fences and security, and make it impossible to help anyone else who gets caught in this. Or they'll actually fix it, actually clean up the contamination and free the shadows trapped in those trees. I photographed the blueprint. My original shadow is in there. So is yours. So are dozens of others. We can't just accept that. Dale watched me work, his expression conflicted. Finally, he pulled out his own phone and started photographing the computer files. "If we're doing this," he said, "we do it right. Document everything, build an airtight case, and we'll need Dr. Chen. She's the only one who understands the science well enough to make them listen." "Is she still alive?" "Last I heard, she was teaching physics at Northwestern, lives in Evanston." Dale downloaded files onto a flash drive. "County forced her to sign an NDA, but if we're already blowing the whistle, she might be willing to break it." We spent an hour gathering evidence. Photos, files, equipment logs, contamination reports. Everything the county had been hiding for 3 decades. When we finished, Dale locked the monitoring station, and we started back through the unmarked territory. The shadows around the oak trees were more active now, moving in agitated patterns. They'd sensed something had changed. Or maybe they'd sensed what we were planning. "They'll fight us," Dale said, watching the shadows writhe. "When we install the UV grid, when we try to force them back to their original hosts, they won't want to go. They've adapted to living in the trees. Some of them have been there so long they've forgotten what it was like to be attached to a person." "Can they stop us?" "I don't know. The protocols protect us from individual shadows, but all of them together, acting in coordination." He shook his head. "That's never happened before. We've never given them a reason to cooperate." We reached the orange flag boundary. Behind us, the shadows had gathered at the edge of the unmarked territory, forming a solid wall of darkness that stretched between the trees, hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Every shadow that had ever detached in Robinson Woods, collected and waiting. One of them separated from the mass. It moved forward slowly, stopping just before the boundary line. It took on a human shape, my height, and raised both hands in what might have been a gesture of supplication or a warning, my original shadow, reaching out one more time. "We're getting you out," I said to it. "All of you, I promise." The shadow lowered its hands, settled back into the mass. The wall of darkness receded, flowing back toward the oak trees like a tide pulling away from shore. Dale and I walked back to the parking lot in silence. We had evidence. We had a plan. We had Dr. Chen's blueprint. Now we just needed to convince the county to build a system to free an army of trapped shadows that might not want to be freed. Dr. Sarah Chen met us at a coffee shop in Evanston 3 days later. She was in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a bun, wearing a Northwestern sweatshirt, and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. When Dale showed her the flash drive, her hands started shaking. "They kept all of this," she whispered, scrolling through the files on her laptop. 30 years of data, 30 years of people suffering, and they just kept monitoring. "We want to build your UV grid," I said. "Force the county to implement it." Dr. Chen looked up from the screen. "The system I designed requires very specific equipment. Industrial UV lamps rated for continuous outdoor operation power generators, capable of running them for 72 hours straight. Installation across a 60-acre contamination zone." She pulled up her original blueprint. "I estimated 6 weeks for full installation, another 2 weeks for calibration." "We don't have 6 weeks. The shadows are getting more aggressive. Yesterday, Tommy's shadow tried to detach during a routine tree marking. The day before, Marcus saw shadow copies of himself wandering near Grid 5. Dale leaned forward. "If we don't act soon, someone's going to die." Dr. Chen closed her laptop. "There's a faster way, riskier, but faster. Instead of installing a permanent grid, we use portable UV flood lamps, the kind they use for curing industrial coatings, position them around the main oak trees, run them off truck-mounted generators. We'd lose the precision of the full system, but we could get it operational in 48 hours. What's the risk? The risk is that without precise calibration, we might not reintegrate the shadows correctly. They could reattach to the wrong hosts. They could fragment during the reintegration process." She reopened her laptop, pulled up a simulation. "But the alternative is doing nothing, and that's no longer acceptable." We spent the rest of the day planning. Dr. Chen had contacts at industrial supply companies who owed her favors. Dale knew contractors who could move equipment quietly. I had the photographs and evidence to make sure the county couldn't shut us down halfway through. By Thursday afternoon, we had 6 portable UV flood lamps set up in a circle around the largest cluster of oak trees. Each lamp stood 8 feet tall on a telescoping stand, its curved reflector aimed downward at the shadow pools. Power cables ran back to generators mounted in Tommy's truck and Jake's van. Dr. Chen had spent 6 hours programming the intensity patterns, adjusting wavelengths, checking and rechecking her calculations. The full crew stood at the edge of the setup. Jake, Tommy, Marcus, Dale, Dr. Chen, and me. We'd also brought Rachel, discharged from the hospital 2 days ago, because she deserved to be here for this. "When I activate the system," Dr. Chen explained, "the UV light will flood the contamination zone. Any shadows within range will be forced to manifest physically. Then the specific wavelength pulses will begin. Think of it as a homing signal, calling each shadow back to its original host." "What do we do if they resist?" Marcus asked. "Stand your ground. The light will be intense. Sunglasses are mandatory. The shadows will try to flee, but the wavelength pattern creates a containment field. They won't be able to leave the illuminated area." She handed out protective eyewear. "Once the reintegration begins, you may feel disoriented. If you have a replacement shadow, you'll experience sensory confusion as your original shadow tries to reclaim its position. This is normal. Don't panic." I put on the sunglasses. My replacement shadow lay quiet beneath my feet, but I could feel it stirring, sensing what was about to happen. "Everyone ready?" Dr. Chen asked. We nodded. She activated the system. The UV lamps ignited with a sound like distant thunder. White light exploded outward, harsh and clean, flooding the forest floor. The oak trees cast dark shadows that stretched away from us, and within those shadows, movement erupted. They came pouring out of the trees like water from a burst dam. Hundreds of shadows, maybe more, spilling across the ground in a dark tide. They scattered in every direction, trying to escape the light, but wherever they ran, the UV beams found them. The shadows began to smoke, their edges dissolving like morning frost. Then Dr. Chen activated the wavelength pulses. The lamps strobed, rapid flashes in patterns too fast to follow consciously. Each pulse seemed to tag the shadows with invisible markers, and I watched as they began organizing themselves, flowing toward specific people, seeking their original hosts. I saw my original shadow break away from the mass. It slid across the ground toward me, moving against the flow of fleeing shadows. And when it reached my feet, it stopped, waited. The replacement shadow currently attached to me tensed, and for a moment, I had two shadows, one above the other, overlapping, fighting for the same space. The sensation was horrifying, like my body was being pulled in two directions, stretched too thin. I could feel memories surfacing, my actual memories, ones the replacement shadow hadn't known about my first day of kindergarten. The smell of my grandmother's kitchen, the weight of my father's hand on my shoulder at my high school graduation. Small things I'd forgotten, now rushing back. The replacement shadow peeled away, not gently, but in one swift motion, like a bandage ripped from a wound. It fell to the ground and immediately began fleeing toward the unmarked territory, joining the mass of displaced shadows trying to escape the UV light. My original shadow flowed up my legs and settled back into position. The connection snapped home with an almost audible click, and suddenly, everything felt right again, complete. Whole, in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Around me, the same thing was happening to everyone else. Dale cried out as his replacement shadow, the one that had belonged to the dead botanist, separated from him. His original shadow, trapped for 5 years in the oak trees, returned like a prodigal child. Dale collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Tommy's shadow reintegrated. Marcus's shadow reintegrated. Even Jake, who'd never mentioned having a replacement, got his original back. Apparently, he'd been living with someone else's shadow for 3 years. Dr. Chen watched the monitors, adjusting intensity levels. The reintegration cascade is holding. 90% success rate so far. Keep the lights running. But the displaced shadows, the ones that had lost their hosts, the ones that couldn't find their original people, they were gathering at the edge of the light, forming a wall again, like they had before. Except this time, they weren't retreating. They were preparing to attack. "Dr. Chen," Rachel said quietly. She was pointing at the shadow mass. "They're organizing." The wall began to move, not fleeing, but advancing, flowing toward us through the UV light despite the pain it was causing them. These were shadows that had nowhere to go. Hosts who'd died years ago. Hosts who'd moved away. Hosts who'd never been identified, desperate and cornered. "Increase the wavelength frequency," Dale shouted, getting back to his feet. "Push them back." Dr. Chim's fingers flew across her laptop. The UV lamps intensified, pulsing faster. The advancing shadow wall slowed, hesitated. "We need to give them somewhere to go," I realized. "They're displaced because their hosts are gone, but if we can anchor them to something else..." The contaminated soil, Dr. Chen interrupted. She was already typing, recalibrating. The same photonic properties that let shadows detach could be reversed. Bind the displaced shadows directly to the contamination source. Neutralize both problems simultaneously. She activated a new pattern. The UV lights changed frequency, and the shadows stopped advancing. They began sinking into the ground instead, being absorbed into the contaminated soil beneath the oak trees. Not trapped like before, but integrated, becoming part of the earth itself. It took 20 minutes. The shadow wall dissolved, shadow by shadow, each one merging with the ground, until the forest floor seemed to darken and then stabilize. The UV lamps continued their pattern, gleaming and binding, fixing what had been broken for 30 years. Finally, Dr. Chen shut down the system. The sudden darkness was shocking. We all stood blinking, pulling off our sunglasses, staring at the oak trees that now looked completely ordinary. The pools of shadow around their roots were gone. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The forest felt like a forest again, just trees and earth and natural light. It worked, Marcus said, stunned. Dale checked his shadow. It moved naturally, responding to his body's position, attached properly. They're all back. Everyone's originals are back. Dr. Chen was already downloading data from the monitors. I'm documenting everything. The county can't deny this happened. They can't cover it up anymore. Rachel walked to the nearest oak tree, one that had been marked with yellow tape, and cautiously placed her hand on the bark. Nothing happened. No shadows reached for her. No tugging sensation. "What about the contamination?" she asked. "The chemical barrels are still buried out here. The shadows are bound to the contamination now," Dr. Chen explained. "Acting as a stabilizing agent. The photonic properties are neutralized. We'll still need proper cleanup, but the supernatural threat is contained." She looked at Dale. "You'll need to file formal reports. Contact the EPA and make sure the county follows through." Dale nodded slowly. "And if they try to stop us?" I held up my phone. "Then we release everything. The files, the photos, the evidence of what they've been hiding. Let the public decide." The crew stood together in the clearing, surrounded by oak trees that were finally just trees. Above us, afternoon light filtered through the leaves, casting normal shadows that didn't move on their own, didn't think, didn't hunger for new hosts. For the first time since I'd started working at Robinson Woods, I felt safe. The EPA arrived the following week. We'd released everything. The files, the photographs, Dr. Chen's testimony, to the Chicago Tribune on Friday night. By Monday morning, federal investigators were cordoning off Robinson Woods with hazmat tape and soil testing equipment. The county tried to claim they'd been planning a comprehensive cleanup for years, but the documentation told a different story. Cook County Board President issued a formal apology on Wednesday, announced a $40 million remediation project, promised full excavation of all contaminated areas, proper disposal of chemical waste, and restoration of the forest preserve to safe public use. I stood at the edge of the work zone, watching contractors in protective suits dig up the buried barrels. They'd found 16 more in the past week, bringing the total to 47. Exactly what the original disposal records had listed. Each barrel was cataloged, removed, and transported to proper hazardous waste facilities. The UV grid stayed in place during the cleanup, modified and expanded according to Dr. Chen's specifications. She'd convinced the EPA that maintaining the photonic containment field was essential to preventing shadow reactivation during excavation. The system had been reclassified from experimental prototype to critical safety equipment. Dale walked up beside me, coffee thermos in hand like always. His original shadow stretched behind him in the morning sun, moving naturally, responding to his movements without hesitation or resistance. "How's it feel?" I asked. "Strange. Good strange." He took a sip of coffee. I'd forgotten what it was like to have my own thoughts all the time. No background static, no sense of someone else driving just me. Marcus and Tommy were working with the EPA team, marking locations where shadow activity had been highest. Their experience navigating the contamination zones made them invaluable consultants. Jake had taken a job with the county's environmental division, helping develop new protocols for handling chemically induced photonic anomalies. Real protocols based on science and proper safety procedures. Rachel had gone back to her normal trail maintenance duties, though she visited the worksite every few days. She'd told me the reintegration had felt like waking up from a dream she couldn't quite remember, like pieces of herself had been scattered and then carefully put back together. Dr. Chen's research was being peer-reviewed at 3 major universities. What had been classified as government cover-up was now groundbreaking physics. Proof that consciousness and shadow were connected in ways quantum mechanics was only beginning to understand. She'd already received funding offers for further study. As for me, I kept working. The logging operation had shut down during the cleanup, but Dale had hired me on as site supervisor for the restoration project. We'd be replanting native species where the contaminated trees had been removed, rebuilding the forest from the ground up. My shadow felt like mine again. The memories were all in the right places. Childhood, adolescence, every moment that made me who I was. Sometimes I still checked it compulsively, making sure it was properly attached. But Dr. Chen assured me that was normal. Trauma response. It would fade with time. The oak trees with yellow tape had been removed, their root systems excavated down to 30 feet. The shadows that had been bound to the contaminated soil during the UV treatment had dispersed naturally once their anchor points were gone. Dr. Chen's theory was that they'd simply dissipated, their energy returning to whatever quantum field shadows originated from. I wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe they'd found peace. On my lunch break, I walked to where the largest oak had stood. Nothing remained but a massive hole in the ground, waiting to be filled with green soil. I looked down at my shadow, my real shadow, and felt grateful for something I'd never thought to appreciate before. The ability to cast darkness. The proof that light existed. The simple fact of being whole. Above me, a work crew installed the final section of permanent UV grid. The system would stay active for 5 years, monitoring and maintaining photonic stability while the forest healed. After that, Robinson Woods would be safe again, open to the public, just another forest preserve in Cook County. But I'd always know what had happened here, what lived in the shadows, what the county had hidden, and what it took to make things right. I finished my coffee and went back to work.